Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the 7th module, Gender and Trade. This module is going to be taking us further into the discussion and speaking specifically about trade and the connections between gender and trade. As we have been saying before, there are many interconnections between several economic concepts and gender. And this module analyzes gender and trade, focusing on the linkages with development and policies, as well as welfare at the meso, micro, macro, and even international level. It examines some of the key concepts in the trade theory from a gender perspective, demonstrating that trade, like macroeconomic policy, is gender blind and not gender neutral. Second, the module discusses the implications of introducing a gender perspective from a trade-related engagement, and that is something else that we shall be looking at. Third, the module critiques the trade liberalization, and the idea behind that critique is to ensure that we understand how trade works for all of us. This leads to the discussion of the gender dimensions that are related to policy in trade and the policy implications of some of the major trade-related policies. The module does also have a little bit about the African Continental Free Trade Area, which is among the 54 out of the 55 African Union countries. And it also briefly discusses the World Trade Organization and some of the related partnerships. At the end of this module, what we want to see is that participants are introduced to the African Continental Free Trade Area. Participants identify broadly and discuss the gender dimensions of, and policy implications of major trade-related policies, and participants develop a gender-aware approach to trade at different levels. Now, in terms of the introduction, gender and trade there are a number of things that we have in this module that I would like to touch on. Gender and trade receive increased interest in the last, say, 5 years. It's been an area of interest in 5 years, especially within the policymakers and some of the development practitioners, as well as civil society. And why is that so? It's because trade systems might advance or sometimes impede gender equality with the varied policy implications at macro, meso, as well as micro levels. And likewise, gender implications and inequalities in trade systems can deter economic growth as well as development overall. However, trade policy makers and development practitioners and civil society are yet to be able to understand the complex relationships between gender and trade. That is, how does trade advance or impede gender equality? Now, how does gender equality affect trade? And what are the implications of a gender-responsive trade system for policy and practice at different levels? And what are some of the entry points for mainstreaming gender in trade policy and practice? These are some of the issues that we shall be touching on. And as we do every time, in the presentation, we just highlight, but then if you want to know more, you will be able to see that in our narrative to this module that you can look at. So let me start by talking about the concept of trade itself. Now, trade is an activity of economic exchange between individuals and groups. that is between economic agents, and it takes various forms, and it will be in different places and locations, and it will have different actors. Individuals exchange goods in a village market. Two nations can be trading cash crops at international level. Trade actors can be state, can be paid, can be unpaid, can be business operators, importers, exporters, consumers. And trade actors have different roles, and they operate at different levels and have different levels of power and influence in the trade system. Now, trade-related concepts are many, but I'm going to touch on one or two that can be helpful for this course. Absolute advantage is one such concept that I would like you to delve into. But when we talk about it, we talk about it in terms of understanding that this is when individuals and groups produce goods at a more cheaper rate than their trading partner. So if you have something cheaper than your trading partner, you have absolute advantage. Competitive advantage, on the other hand, is when individuals and groups produce goods and services at a lower opportunity cost than the other trading partner. And competitive advantage makes specialization and trade socially beneficial on the basis of trade and market operations. Opportunity cost is when the value attached to an activity is based on the most valuable action that you have to forego in order to undertake that activity. So in terms of a broad definition, we say trade is a trade policy is really about, when we talk about defining trade policy, we are defining the formal rules and mechanisms for regulating trading activities at all these different levels, as well as at the international level. And we would usually have some domestic policies. In some other times, in countries, you have domestic policy, fiscal policies, labor market policies. All these would be policies that are geared towards trade. Macro level policies and foreign aid and investment policies can also be trade policies. You have structural adjustment policies and extra many more other types of policies. In trade, you'll find many interesting concepts and debates, but some of the debates are really around trade policy. One of those that clearly keeps coming up is this principle of protectionism through imposition of tariffs on import to support domestic producers through subsidies necessary for the poorer countries with less developed industries to develop their own capacity to produce at competitive level. I brought this out from the different things that are there in the module, but in here you usually have lots of organizations, countries having the debate about the role of protectionism in the economy. How can it be helpful? And developing economies, the argument goes, are not well placed to benefit on equitable terms with the developed nations on free trade. And therefore, sometimes there is this push for protectionism. And development economies are also sometimes, it is argued, do not participate in development of international trade policies. And therefore, sometimes baby protectionism can offer that engagement. Now, that's just one argument around an argument that is usually there in trade policy. But in the related aspects, I just want to nuance this a bit by looking at the issues that then we have to touch on in trade. Now, there is a very high likelihood to us erroneously assume that trade systems, that is both policies and practices, are gender neutral in their outcome and effect, as well as their impact. Yet, Trade policy and practice are highly gendered with differential impacts on the livelihoods, on the status, on the rights of women and men across different contexts, across different races, across different ethnicities, and across different classes. And women, just like men, are key economic actors. Hence, gender is very relevant to trade. Gender is a key factor in understanding the links between trade, growth, and development, and trade policy and practice is therefore not gender neutral, as it is assumed in mainstream macroeconomics. And let's illustrate that point by looking at gender division of labor and, for example, competitive advantage in trade. The acquisition of competitive advantage, for example, is a gendered process. Why? Because gender inequality shapes advantage in two ways. One, women as achievers of competitive advantage through ownership of personal businesses, employing other people or self-employed producers. That is one dimension of competitive advantage. But also on the other, we talk about women as a source of competitive advantage. When women as unpaid family workers, wage workers contributing to businesses owned by others, mainly men, this makes them a source that produces or that supports competitive advantage. Now, what does that require? It requires, to achieve competitive advantage, you require certain things. One, access to land, to technology, to finance, to labor, to social networks, to knowledge, to things like freedom to demand or to decide how you use your time, which markets do you go to, but also a very, very favorable environment. And access to and use of these resources is usually shaped by the inequalities that are there in society. We know the issue around land in many parts of Africa and how actually that limits how many women play in a trade relationship, because when they, for example, need land for Colorado, that's not available, or for many of these different other things that are required for one to be a competitive trader. Now, in societies characterized by gender inequality, women face challenges in accessing resources that enable them to achieve competitive advantage in trade. And even when they gain access to productive resources, social cultural norms sometimes and beliefs prevent these women from using these resources to compete with men in the marketplace. Consequently, there is a gender gap between men and women in the acquisition of competitive advantage. And that gender gap in the acquisition of competitive advantage, therefore, is sometimes related to the social division of labor between men and women, but also in the fact that women will be playing a bigger and much more intensive role focusing on unpaid care work. So the achievement of competitive advantage by women is visible only in the niche market, mostly at the local level in micro enterprises where competition is limited. But when you go to larger enterprises, sometimes you do not see that coming through. Let's talk about gender, trade liberalization, and competitive advantage. Women also dominate the micro enterprises in most poor and developing countries as own account food producers. And cutting tariffs on food imports exposes women at small scale food producers to competition from foreign agribusinesses. And the latter may likely also have a competitive advantage of those ones who are producing the foreign agribusinesses and the smaller producers. And this is a tension that is there in countries, for example, in one of the crops like rice. Rice is one of those where in Africa, most of it is imported because there are some producers in Asia that are very competitive. And even when small producers on the continent grow rice, they sometimes find it much more expensive to produce than others. And women farmers also find it difficult to take advantage of new opportunities within the context of trade liberalization due to the limited access to credit, new technologies, and other things. Now, studies have also established the trade liberalization policies in economies where women are encouraged in macro enterprises or own production, account production, to have more adverse effects on women's livelihoods than economies where women are more engaged in paid work. So consequently, gender inequality places women much more as a source of, rather than achievers of, competitive advantage in trade. Now, women constitute a source of competitive advantage for producers using labor-intensive methods of production due to unequal gender relations, especially as the household, but also due to gender gaps that occur in markets. And women in some of the smallholder agricultural production serve as unpaid laborers under the direction of male relatives who earn cash for their activity, and sometimes the women engage in cross production for livelihood. And in the event of increase in market access and consequent expansion in production of cash due to trade liberalization, household income may increase, but the impact on women is not always automatic. And to the extent to which women and men share household income is determined by the intra-household bargaining power. Now, in the feminist economics and trade, this really focuses on gender as a unit of analysis in trade at all levels. The main argument in feminist economics and trade is that gender neutrality of trade undermines the role of women as economic actors, and women play three roles as producers, employees, consumers, and in reproducing as well as caring for the labor force. The non-monetized and invisible contribution of women to the economy, estimated at least at US dollars 11 trillion per year, is one of those that is also an issue that we have to pay attention to. And the gender roles and gender division of labor shape the relationship between men and women in society, as well as their access to economic resources, land, credit, technology, and other things. And the gender approach to trade is relevant to understand the gender impact of trade systems. So what, therefore, the economic analysis of the feminist economic analysis, therefore, want to emphasize, it seeks to understand the impact of gender division of labor on women's empowerment, on well-being, and on the types of work that they undertake, and also to analyze women's unpaid work and how the intensification and expansion of trade may affect this. Let's move on to gender and value chain analysis in trade. Now, what are value chains? Very briefly, value chains are the range of activities involved in the production of goods and services from consumption through different transformation stages to the delivery of a final product to a consumer. And a sequence of targeted oriented combinations of production factors that create a marketable product or service from conception to final consumption is also defined as a value chain. And value chains of goods and services increase as it progresses in the value of goods and services usually increases as a good and service progresses through the value chain. Now, women and men are located at different levels of the value chain. This is something you can read a little bit more on. And women are mostly located in the less visible areas of the value chain, often or which are overlooked in the value chain analysis. Now, large parts of the value chain, which are essential to upgrading, are often ignored, particularly things like homemaking, home work, unpaid work, or putting out and temporary work, and all those kinds of things. And that in itself is a challenge. And gender analysis of the value chain is therefore relevant to understand why women dominate particular levels of production chains and men in the other. Now, let's talk a little bit about gender and trade-related agreements. You'll agree with me that we are going fast over these concepts, but the idea is to give you just a flash of each one of these, and you'll be able to go back and read and understand where we are coming from. At a macro and micro analysis of the relationship between gender and trade and growth, you can look at and I'll try and post this article by Elson, who suggests that gender inequality in trade limits growth both directly and indirectly due to factors such as access to assets that limit women's options, issues like labor remunerations that lead to conflicts in households and affect labor allocation at a domestic level, issues like productivity, limit economic efficiency and output, and gender inequality actually accounts for 20% of the difference in growth performance between sub-Saharan African countries and, for example, East Asian countries. So trade issues are not only limited to macroeconomic frameworks, but have implications for even strategic sectors like agriculture, intellectual property, investment, and others. And gender trade policy and practice has also implications for things like employment, livelihood, and human rights through the impact of things like prices, employment, production systems, and much more. And so the impact will vary for different groups based on their differential positions in the economic system. The position occupied within the economic system does not only vary with the context, but also is based on the social cultural variables like ethnicity, gender, and even class. Now, trade policy and liberalization and multilateral trading is also an area that I want you to read a little bit about. And this has been very, very central to the discourse on multi-trading systems. The relationship between trade liberalization, economic growth, has been a continuous source of contention between developed and developing countries since the establishment, say, of the World Trade Organization. And the argument is that trade liberalization equals an increase in overall production, poverty reduction, growth and development. And this is what is usually supported or promoted by the developed countries. And cheaper foreign goods enter into the labor markets, and they provide cheap options for consumers, but they also severely constrain domestic and indigenous producers, and they affect the national expenditure through a reduction of tax revenue resulting from cartels in trade tariffs. To emphasize the concept of free trade, trading systems dictated by market forces is one of the things that has sometimes been promoted. But the thing is that there are many debates in this area. I don't want to go through all the debates, but I want to encourage all of you to get a chance and look at what the debates say. But let me say something about the multilateral trading system. When we talk about the multilateral trading system, what we are usually referring to here is a set of agreements and legal rules that are binding and relating to the structure of the internal trading system, that are binding to nations, that are binding to those who are signatories. And they shape the trading rights, the opportunities, the obligations of different member states. And they are informed by what is known as the Doha Development Agenda, which was adopted in the 4th Ministerial Council Conference of the World Trade Organization in 2001. And so the World Trade Organization is at the center of the multilateral trading system. But I invite you to find time and read a little bit about that. If you want to look at an article, please write to me and I'll be able to provide an article. But let me quickly move to the African Common Free Trade Area, because this is one of the very, very important things that Africa has done in the recent past. And the African Common Market Free Trade Area was actually signed in Kigali in 2018, when the African Ministers of Trade recommended the fast tracking of the continental free trade area. The negotiations established the AfTA, was launched in the 25th Ordinary Session, and they were geared towards liberalization of trade. And the underlying principles that guided the negotiations included reciprocity, substantial liberalization, non-discriminatory principles, most favored nations treatment, flexibility, special and differential treatment. I won't go into a detailed discussion, but again, I can provide articles that can help with this. And the journey that started with the initiation of the African Common Market Free Trade Area in November 2010, therefore ended in Kigali in 2018. The AU's projection is that the AfTA will have a significant impact on trade relations between its signatories, and that it will increase the level of intra-African trade by up to 60% by 2022. Now, UNECA estimates that the agreement has the potential to boost intra-African trade by up to 52.3%, and also eliminating trade barriers, and also double to double if non-trade barriers are also reduced. And the agreement will, by so doing, enhance African integration, transformation, as well as development. Now, what are some of the gender issues in AfTA? Liberal trade policies, including the formation of the trade agreements, have some positive implications in achieving women's economic empowerment, and these include greater inclusion of women in trade marketplace, the opportunities for women-owned small and medium-sized enterprises to expand their trade overseas, labor provisions in the trade agreements, programs that help women in business training, as well as financing programs and connecting women to different types of supply networks. But there are several downsides that haven't yet been worked out in terms of the critique on AfTA. That one of them is that, however, women's employment has mainly still stayed and increased in the unskilled sector, and women are willing to expand their businesses still face some of the barriers that are coming from gender inequalities. Trade liberalization may also worsen women's economic and social status, leading to the persistence and widening wage and occupational gaps. The gender-differentiated effects of trade liberalization are also felt at macro, meso, and micro levels, and as a result, the differences between women and men in their access to assets and other things, as we've said before, are also felt. At a micro level, gender gaps in market participation may also narrow if sectors that expand trade liberalization are more female intensive. And this continues also at the meso level. You could also have differentials that are impacted by, for example, tariff cuts. And at the micro level, trade liberalization may actually extend or reduce female control over household spending, depending on whether it creates or destroys sources of independent income for women. So, ladies and gentlemen, there is a lot to say about gender and trade. I have highlighted some of the key issues that will make this discussion much more interesting. And I would like to invite you to do a little bit more reading, looking specifically at the narrative that we produced in terms of demonstrating, in terms of articulating the issues in this module, but also at the literature. But those are some of the key issues that we want to look at. If we're in a physical meeting, we'll do some exercises so that some of you can understand a bit more around this work on gender and trade. So with that, I want to thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to seeing you in the next module. Thank you.